The only real freedom you will ever achieve in life is the moment you become completely comfortable with being hated. We are taught that the highest human aspirations, love, success, peace, revolve around gaining consensus, around being seen as good, just, and righteous by the external world. This foundational assumption is the single greatest lie ever imposed upon the human spirit, because the pursuit of external validation is not a path to liberation. It is the voluntary acceptance of psychological slavery. You spend your life calibrating your movements, your political speech, your career choices, and even the intimacy of your private thoughts against the anticipated judgment of the crowd, the fear of the social guillotine. We do this because we are terrified of the villain's paradox. The paradox states this: the moment you stop caring about your public perception, the moment you allow yourself to be cast as the antagonist in someone else's shallow narrative, is precisely the moment you achieve true, undeniable sovereignty over your own existence. This is the dark, uncomfortable truth that philosophy often tries to sanitize. Your independence is directly proportional to your willingness to wear the mask of the monster, if that is the price of living authentically. Understand this: the majority of people are not seeking truth. They are seeking comfort in numbers. Their opinions are not complex moral judgments. They are simply loyalty signals, indicators that they belong to the correct tribe. When you align your life to please this amorphous audience, you are not elevating your virtue. You are diluting your essence to fit the lowest common denominator of tribal acceptability. You become a psychological hostage, forever bound by the shifting demands of judges who are themselves terrified of independent thought. They punish deviation not because it is wrong, but because it exposes the fragility of their own manufactured consensus. If you are tired of the polite lies, the self-help affirmations that keep you chained to the consensus, and the perpetual exhausting pursuit of external validation, then you understand the depth of this challenge. Hit that subscribe button right now. We need more minds willing to abandon the comfort of the crowd and explore the dark mechanics of freedom. The greatest psychological burden placed upon the modern person is the belief that they must always be the protagonist of a universally approved story. We strive to be the hero, the martyr, the misunderstood genius, so long as our actions can be framed in the light of ultimate goodness. But the true act of self-ownership requires you to recognize the fundamental futility of this pursuit. Every great life, every decisive action, every genuine piece of creation necessarily requires collateral damage to the delicate ego of others. To build, you must tear down. To choose one path, you must reject 1,000 alternatives. And in those rejections, you inevitably become the obstacle, the antagonist, the villain in the unwritten history of those who chose differently or failed to choose at all. You become the villain simply by existing powerfully in a world designed for weakness. The moment you internalize this inevitable cost, the moment you realize that integrity is often indistinguishable from antagonism, you have unlocked the first gate to freedom. You stop negotiating with ghosts. You must stop asking the crowd for permission to define yourself. The crowd is not a judge. It is a cheap, broken mirror, reflecting back its own collective fear and insecurity. When you chase their approval, you are merely asking 1,000 broken fragments to confirm your wholeness, a task that is metaphysically impossible. The villain's paradox demands that you cease the performance entirely. When you are truly free, you are not merely ignoring their opinions. You are treating them as entirely irrelevant data points. The opinion of others only holds weight if you grant it jurisdiction over your soul. Withdraw that jurisdiction entirely. Embrace the possibility of being fundamentally misunderstood, not misunderstood in a romantic, brooding sense, but fundamentally and viciously miscategorized as a detriment, a mistake, or an enemy. Only then does the psychological tether snap. This is the architecture of the mind that cannot be swayed, cannot be blackmailed, and cannot be owned. It is the foundation of genuine, unassailable power. The suffering is not the pain of rejection itself. The suffering is the pathological refusal to accept that our deepest drive, the evolutionary imperative for social cohesion, is now in the modern landscape of infinite anonymous validation, the single greatest impediment to self-actualization. We are biologically wired to fear ostracism because for the first 2 million years of human history, banishment from the tribe meant certain death. That ancient terror still fires synapses today, meaning that every time you consider an action that might cause social friction, your brain is treating that friction as a threat to your physical survival. This is the source of the profound internal conflict. We confuse the temporary, flimsy currency of social acceptance with the non-negotiable necessity of biological existence. We trade our potential for comfort, substituting real structural integrity with the soothing delusion of belonging. The vast majority of human unhappiness stems from this continuous, exhausting performance review we subject ourselves to, using external metrics we never agreed upon. We become perpetual auditors of our own existence, constantly checking the ledgers of our achievements, our virtue signaling, and our outward success against the imaginary expectations of phantom observers. This pathological self-consciousness turns life into a state of chronic surveillance. You are never truly alone because the internalized crowd, the collection of critics, parents, peers, and forgotten ex-lovers, is always sitting in the theater of your mind, ready to boo any genuine impulse toward independent action. If you believe this analysis rings true, if you recognize this constant, crippling negotiation with the self, then you understand that the stakes are too high to miss the subsequent steps of this psychological architecture. Do not let the feed distract you from the truth. Hit that subscribe button right now to ensure you receive the roadmap for exiting this debilitating performance. The moment you commit to becoming the antagonist in the stories of the week, you stop caring about your own narrative comfort. What you gain is clarity, a cold, hard understanding of your own constraints and capabilities, unmediated by the flattering distortion of external praise. The psychological depth of freedom lies in the realization that true self-respect is incompatible with the pursuit of pity or popularity. Pity is merely discounted respect, and popularity is just highly leveraged vulnerability. When you chase either, you are sacrificing the solidity of your own structure for the temporary sensation of being held up by other people's hands. This is why the pursuit of authenticity, as preached by modern self-help gurus, is almost always a cowardly retreat. They teach you to reveal a curated, comfortable vulnerability designed to elicit positive feedback, not the true, ugly, consequential authenticity that generates genuine fear and antagonism. The true act of psychological liberation requires you to embrace the concept of earned isolation. The deeper your thoughts, the more difficult your chosen path, the more you necessarily move away from the common ground of shallow consensus. That movement is often interpreted by those left behind as abandonment or betrayal. Their suffering, the pain of their rejection, is the collateral cost of your intellectual and moral trajectory. You cannot scale a mountain without leaving the comfortable valley floor. But the suffering of the non-free is infinitely greater than the burden of the isolated thinker. The non-free suffer the quiet agony of perpetual self-betrayal, the low-grade, constant shame of living a life optimized for other people's approval, slowly trading their potential for guaranteed safety. If you find value in these relentless critiques of the comfortable lie, and if you believe that content which refuses to dilute truth for mass consumption is worth preserving, please take a moment to subscribe and support this work. This is the psychological exchange at the heart of our modern malaise. We exchange the heavy mantle of self-ownership for the light yoke of social participation, only to find that the yoke chafes perpetually. The anxiety that plagues society is not existential fear. It is the fear of being found out, of being revealed as the fraud who is only playing the part written for them by their culture, their family, or their own fear. To cure this anxiety, you must dismantle the performance entirely. You must realize that the very attempt to manage other people's perception of you is the most profound act of self-neglect. It means you have outsourced the construction of your soul to the cheapest bidder. You must move past the infantile need for validation and step into the unblinking light of self-generated value. The light of self-generated value is blinding because it operates on an entirely different spectrum than the dull, ambient glow of social acceptance. It demands competence, and competence is inherently terrifying to the approval-driven mind. Competence doesn't ask permission. It doesn't need a committee meeting or a validation score. It simply produces results that stand independent of feeling, consensus, or politics. This is why so many successful people are deeply miserable frauds. They mastered the performance of success, the networking, the vocabulary, the mandated self-promotion, but they never developed the foundational competence necessary to justify the position they attained. Their anxiety is not merely fear of failure. It is the dread of exposure, the knowledge that the immense structure of their life rests on the rotten foundation of image management. Consider the archetype of the high-level corporate executive, let us call him the Senior Vice President of Strategic Synergy, who occupies a role of immense authority, but whose actual output is entirely divorced from measurable value. His success is built on a specific, non-consequential form of authenticity. He knows exactly which vulnerabilities to display in a management retreat, which buzzwords signal intellectual alignment, and how to project the exhausted martyr image of someone carrying the entire company on their back. He is a fraud who has mastered the art of managing institutional anxiety. The profound, brutal real-world proof of this psychological exchange is the epidemic of late-stage professional collapse, the sudden, catastrophic burnout in a man's late 40s or early 50s. He hasn't collapsed because the work became too hard. He collapsed because the maintenance cost of the performance finally exceeded his psychological reserves. The mask fuses to the face, and when he tries to peel it off, he realizes there is nothing underneath. The price of trading self-ownership for a corner office is the realization that you have become the most expensive, highly credentialed slave in the entire system. His crisis is not a sudden epiphany. It is the scheduled system failure of a self-optimized solely for external metrics. To escape this trap, you must consciously destroy the performance, and this demands a temporary, necessary cruelty, a psychological triage. You must identify every relationship, every commitment, and every social obligation that exists only to feed the image you are trying to dismantle, and you must cut them off. The people who only liked the mask will hate your true face. They will call your self-rescue selfishness, narcissism, or treason. This is the moment you must embrace the fact that your moral obligation is not to soothe the expectations of the non-free, but to secure your own intellectual sovereignty. If you find yourself nodding along to this diagnosis, recognizing the systemic rot of image over substance, and if you believe that content dedicated to unflinching philosophical analysis deserves to exist outside the algorithms of feel-good distraction, please subscribe now. Your support ensures we can continue to dissect the psychological mechanisms that keep the majority comfortably miserable. The path to self-generated value means shifting your focus from being accepted to becoming dangerous. Not physically dangerous, but consequentially dangerous. Dangerous to lies, dangerous to complacency, and therefore dangerous to the established order of mediocrity. The authentic self, the self that has chosen isolation and competence, possesses an intimidating psychological gravity. It repels those who rely on social friction and gossip to define their boundaries. When you stop chasing validation, you stop participating in the market of fear. You become the immovable object against which the torrent of cultural neurosis breaks. This is the only true cure for anxiety. The profound, cold certainty that you have built your own foundation, stone by solitary stone, and that no external judgment can threaten the structure. The free human is one who has nothing left to lose because they have nothing left to prove. The critical error that perpetuates the cycle of external dependence is the great contemporary deception regarding vulnerability. We are saturated by the narrative that authentic selfhood requires the public performance of fragility, that true strength lies in the constant, open exposure of wounds. This is a profound and lucrative lie. Much of what passes for emotional honesty is, in reality, a highly optimized, desperate plea for social credit and community soothing. It is the sophisticated continuation of the validation market, merely switching the accepted currency from external achievement to shared trauma. When you broadcast your pain, you are not engaging in self-healing. You are outsourcing the emotional labor of resolution, demanding that an audience acknowledge and validate the suffering that only you can truly transmute into action. This keeps you weak. tethered to the variable empathy of strangers. True vulnerability is silent. It is the terrifying private moment of admitting failure to yourself, without the safety net of an audience ready to congratulate you simply for articulating the pain. That internal confession is the moment of maximum psychological danger and maximum growth, precisely because it is unrewarded by social friction. It demands responsibility, not rescue. The person who has achieved consequential danger understands that pain is not a badge of honor to be displayed, but data to be processed. Data must be analyzed and utilized internally. It should not be broadcast into the cultural atmosphere. When you are processing data internally, you are preparing to act. When you are broadcasting it externally, you are preparing to wait for rescue. The former is sovereignty. The latter is learned helplessness disguised as openness. This level of unflinching psychological triage, this refusal to grant moral superiority to convenient emotional display, is actively discouraged by the systems that profit from perpetual dependency. If you recognize the necessity of this deeper analysis, the kind of philosophical work that refuses to coddle modern anxieties and insists on uncomfortable clarity over easy comfort, consider supporting the depth of this investigation by subscribing. It is this intellectual rigor, often unpopular but always essential, that we fight to maintain. The free self, the self that has mastered its anxiety, realizes that power is generated through the strategic withholding of self. You cannot be exploited by those who do not know what you want, what you fear, or what motivates your next action. The competent self is necessarily opaque. It moves in silence, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The constant demand for transparency, for an accounting of your internal world to external observers, is merely another leash designed to maintain social control. When you cease to be predictable, you cease to be manageable. The performance of emotional accessibility is a massive psychological drain, forcing you to maintain a secondary existence for the benefit of those who feel entitled to your interior landscape. But your interior landscape is your last fortress, and the moment you permit guided tours, you compromise its defenses. The truly sovereign human understands that their strength is proportional to the size of their unshared reserve. We must recognize the difference between self-expression and self-expulsion. Self-expression is the deliberate articulation of earned understanding. Self-expulsion is the desperate venting of unmanaged chaos in the hope that someone else will organize it for you. The modern landscape encourages expulsion because it creates endless content and endless need for therapists, coaches, and validation sources. It sustains the entire industry of outsourced selfhood. To reverse this, you must adopt an aggressive economy of speech, both public and private. Train yourself to solve rather than describe. Train yourself to act rather than explain the intention to act. The authentic self is not the self that is most easily read, but the self that is most consequentially felt. Its power resides not in its openness, but in its efficacy. This transition from open book to closed circuit is brutal because it demands that you become your own primary audience, judge, and executioner, a role most people actively avoid through distraction and social noise. The silence is where the true work begins, and the terrifying truth is that you are the only one who can grade your own homework. The refusal to inhabit the closed circuit is rooted in a fundamental psychological terror, the fear of being the sole unmediated witness to your own unedited consciousness. We treat our lives like proof-of-concept software, constantly pushing beta versions to the public for debugging, hoping that the collective gaze will somehow shore up the deficiencies we cannot bear to confront alone. This need to be externally validated, to have our identity notarized by a sufficient number of strangers, is the core affliction of outsourced selfhood. It's not that we don't understand who we are. It's that we don't trust who we are until that identity has been confirmed and applauded by others. This confirmation acts as a powerful anesthetic against the existential pain of having to be truly responsible for the meaning of your own existence. The competent self is terrifying because it requires you to be both the entire audience and the sole critic, demanding a self-sufficiency that feels like total isolation in a culture designed for codependence. We suffer because we mistake validation for reality. We confuse the fleeting warmth of being understood by others with the durable heat of self-generated purpose. This obsession with external witnessing degrades the quality of our internal life. The interior monologue, that crucial private debate where character is actually forged, ceases to be a rigorous, self-correcting mechanism. Instead, it devolves into a desperate script-writing session, a continuous rehearsal designed not for truth, but to maximize external pity or admiration. You become your own PR agent, perpetually optimizing your flaws for maximum relatability and your successes for maximum envy. If this deep dive into the hidden and often ugly architecture of the dependent self is compelling you to look inward, if it feels like we are challenging the fundamental operating system of your life, then consider subscribing now. It ensures that the algorithms cannot silence this kind of inconvenient, analytical truth, and it supports the creation of the difficult, uncompromising content that actually demands a change in how you perceive reality. The moment you exchange internal authority for external acceptance, your structural integrity becomes borrowed, not built. This is the definition of psychological immaturity. The highly transparent person, the one who feels compelled to narrate every emotional wobble and minor victory, is often merely a poorly constructed facade whose only stability comes from the scaffolding of public attention. When the audience leaves, the structure collapses. The truly competent individual, by contrast, operates on a different substrate. Their interior life is a silent, high-pressure environment where every thought is a calculated force, not a released sigh. They know that the energy wasted in explaining the self could be better spent perfecting the self. This is why the path to sovereignty is defined by subtraction, not addition. Subtraction of external noise, subtraction of unnecessary speech, subtraction of borrowed identities. You must reclaim the space between stimulus and response, turning it from a public plaza into a private laboratory. Until you can withstand the full gravity of your own unshared existence, you will remain eternally tethered to the external world, incapable of generating your own meaningful gravity. The final verdict of the philosophy of opacity is this: to be entirely known is to be entirely owned. If you sacrifice your reserve, you sacrifice your leverage, and ultimately, you sacrifice your freedom. This isn't a call for pathological secrecy. It is a necessary defense against psychological debt. Every public utterance, every detail you voluntarily disclose, every attempt to manage the public perception of your suffering is a kind of promissory note, a credit line opened against your future freedom. The delusion of the modern era is that vulnerability is a universal superpower, that to expose your tender points will somehow compel the world to gentleness. This is a profound, costly error. The world is not your therapist. The world is a market, and in the market of power, revealed weakness is not met with sympathy, but with a sudden predatory readjustment of price. You reveal the chink in the armor not to earn applause for your honesty, but to provide the exact coordinates for the incoming strike. The people who preach the necessity of immediate, total transparency are often those who profit from the public's constant, cheap flow of emotional capital, or those who are too afraid to deal with their own existence in silence. True integrity is not found in narrating your struggle. It is found in aligning your internal actions with your expressed values, regardless of whether there is an audience present to certify the performance. The sovereign self is fundamentally authentic because it has nothing left to prove to the outside. It is not seeking validation, but merely acting as a consistent, unbending law unto itself. Consider the brutal reality of the celebrity or the political figure who attempts to get ahead of a crisis by owning the narrative. They engage in the carefully choreographed confession, the tearful explanation of their past moral failings, the detailed exposition of their inner demons, the insistence on their current state of profound, relatable anxiety. They mistake the tactical retreat for a moral victory. Look closely at how the media, and more importantly, their rivals, respond. They do not forgive. They catalog. The very details shared in a desperate attempt to be humanized become the operational specifications for their future destruction. The drug habit confessed becomes the legal reason for disqualification. The moment of deep personal doubt revealed becomes the public evidence of professional instability. The audience doesn't admire the transparency. They catalog the weakness, storing the vulnerability not as an act of courage, but as a liability they can cash in later. When their stock drops or their political capital wanes, the first weapons deployed against them are the very truths they willingly provided, believing they were purchasing immunity through self-disclosure. In the marketplace of power, confession is often nothing more than the pre-filing of the execution warrant. If this essay is pushing against the comfortable narrative you have constructed around your identity, if it is forcing you to reckon with the hidden cost of living an externally dependent life, then please take a moment to subscribe. We exist to produce the analysis that cannot be found on the algorithm's curated menu, the uncompromising examination of psychological architecture that most content creators are too afraid to touch. Subscribing is the clearest signal you can send that you value depth over dilution. The most potent form of political and psychological leverage is always held by the individual whose internal landscape remains undocumented. The truly formidable person does not need to advertise their pain to earn support or their victory to earn status. Their gravity is felt, not narrated. They understand that psychological ownership begins the moment you refuse to surrender your internal resources to the public economy of attention. The great figures of history, whether creators, thinkers, or conquerors, were rarely known for their emotional transparency. They were known for their effects. The self was a generating force, hidden behind a deliberate and necessary veil, focused entirely on the outcome, not the commentary. We must learn to become opaque again, not out of fear, but out of strategic self-preservation. When you refuse to be legible to the forces that seek to manage, control, or profit from your anxiety, you become free. The final, devastating truth is that the greatest act of self-love you can perform in this overexposed age is the systematic, radical withdrawal of your inner life from the public sphere. The most valuable commodity you possess is not your attention, but your inaccessibility. The self, the true core of agency, is an engine that runs on fuel that must not be shared. The private shame, the solitary ambition, the unshared moment of pure, terrifying clarity. To live well in the 21st century is to understand that the public sphere is not a garden for nurturing identity, but a highly efficient smelter designed to extract and homogenize psychological resources. Therefore, the verdict is simple and absolute. Sovereignty is silence. The quest for total psychological transparency is a sophisticated form of self-sabotage, an unwitting signing over of your most essential leverage to the forces of external validation and systemic control. Your task is not to curate the perfect public version of yourself. Your task is to build an inner world so complex, so dense, and so fiercely protected that it defies easy categorization and resists extraction. Let the masses seek comfort in the lukewarm, transient glow of shared vulnerability. Let them barter their dignity for likes and comments. But you must embrace the profound, cold strength of the inaccessible self. Stop chasing the radioactive warmth of public affirmation. While they are busy consuming the manufactured drama of others, you must be quietly, relentlessly constructing your fortress. The power of the unseen is absolute. If this perspective resonates, if you feel the deep necessity of building a mind that resists the cultural demand for constant performance, then join the community we are building. Subscribe now to stand with those who choose depth, sovereignty, and the strategic silence that defines true power. The verdict is this: stop trying to win the rigged game of visibility. Your greatest victory will be your disappearance from the system's ledger. The life worth living is the one the algorithm cannot detect, cannot monetize, and cannot replicate. You are not meant to be a data point. You are meant to be an event. The digital world demands constant emotional output, turning you into a perpetually draining battery for the entertainment of others. Refuse the drain. Become the ultimate black box, impenetrable, private, and terrifyingly self-sufficient. This is the only philosophy that guarantees true longevity of soul in the age of infinite scrutiny. We have been conditioned to believe that freedom is the capacity to express anything. The painful, deeper truth is that freedom is the radical capacity to withhold everything. Do not mistake the compulsion to share for the act of living. Do not sacrifice the cold, complex engine of your soul merely to feel the warm approval of passing strangers. Let the rest scream for recognition in the echoing void of the internet. You, however, must whisper your intentions only to yourself. Build your empire in the dark, where true complexity thrives, and where the roots of your identity can run deep, undisturbed by the superficial demands of public perception. The final irony of modern existence is that the only way to become unforgettable is to first become unseeable. The final verdict on modern sanity is simple. Your silence is not merely a boundary, it is your ultimate weapon. The greatest asset you possess is the data you refuse to generate. Let them chase the fleeting, addictive dopamine hit of the public gaze. You must understand that the most potent life is the one lived loudest inside your own head, where the true architecture of your destiny is erected in absolute stillness. If this philosophy clarifies your path, if you are ready to trade the shallow applause for profound self-possession, make sure you subscribe now. Join the growing community committed to building the sovereign self, recognizing that to be truly powerful today, you must first become profoundly unavailable. Your final act of rebellion is withdrawing the performance. The age of surveillance ends the moment you refuse to be seen. You must now choose profound presence over digital permanence. Subscribe and join the silent few.